Have you always wanted to play a deck that combines spell slinging with an aggressive creature strategy? Do you like the idea of making multiple copies of creatures for big value and game-ending damage? Is your playstyle that of a true red mage, where you like to play hard and fast and leave it all on the line? Then I think it's time we set the world on fire with Rionya Fire Dancer. Let's start by seeing what Rionya brings to the table. Rionya Fire Dancer is a 5 mana 3/4 human wizard that says, at the beginning of combat on your turn, create X tokens that are copies of another target creature you control, where X is 1 plus the number of instants and sorceries you've cast this turn. They gain haste. Exile them at the beginning of the next end step. So to start with, Rionya wants us to have creatures on the battlefield that are worth cloning, and because we are going to lose those clones at the beginning of the next end step, we want to make sure that those clones have a big impact when they hit the board. She also wants us to cast multiple instants and sorceries a turn to make the most of her ability, so we want to make sure that we run a lot of low mana value instants and sorceries that draw cards and make mana to help us get that trigger as high as possible. This means a few things. Firstly, our low mana value spells will grant us the ability to have some very explosive turns due to the number of spells we can potentially cast a turn. If we have the right creature out, this could mean game over for our opponents. And secondly, because we are trading card quality for speed, we are going to struggle if the game goes long. So we have to make sure that the game is ours before our opponents have a chance to set up their value engines. But this is what we signed up for, and if we're going to make the mono red archetype proud, we have to go hard or go home. So let's begin by looking at the ways we're going to be making mana, which we're going to need a lot of if we plan to storm off. First up is Rite of Flame, Poetic Ritual, Desperate Ritual, and Seething Song. These are all mana rituals that give us greater mana than we invested in them, allowing us to cast more spells to get Rionya's trigger count higher. Mana Geyser, while costing 5 mana, is a very powerful ritual effect that adds red to our mana pool based on the number of tapped lands our opponents have. Resolving this with a few cantrips in hand can very easily result in us storming off and creating a game-winning number of clones. Strike it Rich is a 1 mana sorcery that creates a treasure token, so it essentially pays for itself while adding to our Rionya count. Not only this, but we can flash it back for 3 mana. Having cards that can be cast multiple times are very strong in this deck, especially ones that can be cast from the graveyard. As you'll soon see, we run quite a few looting effects, so having cards that we want to pitch is very welcome. Battle Hymn is a 2 mana instant that adds red mana based on the number of creatures we control. With only 1 to 2 creatures on board, this just acts to add to our storm count. But after our first combat where we still have the clones on board, this can become a big ritual effect, allowing us to cast our card draw spells and dig for our win cons. Jeska's Will is a 3 mana sorcery that either adds red mana based on the number of cards in a target opponent's hand, or exiles the top 3 cards of our library, which we can play that turn. If we have our commander out, we can do both. Often in decks that run Jeska's Will, they want to hold off on casting it until they have their commander out. In this deck, often you will cast it turn 3 to 4 if you have the right cards in hand and on board, so don't be afraid to cast it early if the situation warrants it. Jeska's Will is a powerful card in its own right, but the fact it is mana and card advantage in one makes it even more powerful in the deck, and you will almost always be happy to see it. Rousing Refrain is a 5 mana sorcery that says, add red mana for each card in target opponent's hand. Until end of turn, you don't lose this mana as steps and phases end. Exile Rousing Refrain with 3 time counters on it. It also has Suspend 3 for 2 mana. So normally a sorcery that costs 5 is not where we want to be in a deck like this, but this card is actually quite powerful early and late in the game. Early, we can cast it turn 2, so on turn 5 we get to cast it for free, add into Rionya's trigger count and setting up with mana to storm off. But if we draw it mid to late game, this is a time when at least one opponent has a full hand, and sometimes we can get really lucky if they've had a Consecrated Sphinx or Rhystic Study out drawing them lots of cards, therefore giving us a lot of mana to work with. Also keep in mind we don't lose this mana as steps and phases end, so when we do go to combat we can target a card advantage creature and use those cards to hopefully find a win in the second main phase. If that wasn't enough, after Rousing Refrain resolves itself, it exiles itself with another 3 time counters so we can cast it again for free. Though the long game is not where we want to end up, having access to a lot of mana if we do will be a big help in trying to close it out. Arcane Signet is a 2 mana artifact that taps to add red. Even though we are a mono red deck, producing red matters due to the number of cantrips and rituals we plan to cast in one turn. Reckless Barbarian is a 2 mana creature we can sacrifice to add 2 red mana. Early it can act as a ritual effect to resolve Rionya or a powerful creature, but we can also keep it on board and target it with Rionya's ability if we have cantrips in hand and need the mana to storm off further in our second main phase. Dockside Extortionist is a 2-mana creature we will be very happy to target with Rionya if we need more mana. It isn't uncommon for Dockside to generate 4 to 8 treasures in the early game, more if the game has gone longer, so being able to make multiple copies of him will ensure we have more than enough mana to do what we need to. Runaway Steamkin is a 2-mana creature that gets a +1/+1 counter every time we cast a red spell, provided it has fewer than 3 +1/+1 counters on it already. Its other ability allows us to remove 3 +1/+1 counters to add 3 red mana to our mana pool. So this essentially acts as a mana storage engine for the deck, which will be very useful when we are storming off. But if it comes down early, it also helps us build up mana before our big storm turn too. Ruby Medallion is a 2-mana artifact that reduces the cost of all our red spells by 1 generic mana. In a deck that is built around trying to cast as many spells as possible in a turn, cost reduction effects like this are very powerful and go a long way towards supporting that plan. Cursed Mirror is a 3-mana artifact that taps for red but also says, as Cursed Mirror enters the battlefield, you may have it become a copy of any creature on the battlefield until end of turn, except it has haste. So in some cases we will be casting this with no good targets on board just to ramp. Other times we'll make another copy of a creature we have on board for extra value. But in some cases, an opponent will have a very powerful creature on board. If we can make multiple copies of an Archon of Cruelty or Agent of Treachery, it could mean game over for our opponents. Burgi, God of Storytelling, is a 3-mana creature that adds a red mana every time we cast a spell. As we discussed with Ruby Medallion, cards that reduce the cost of spells we cast are very powerful in Storm decks, and that's essentially what Burgi does. The fact we don't lose the mana between steps and phases can also be useful if we plan to cast spells post-combat, but still have Burgi mana floating. In addition, this card can also provide us card advantage if we cast it for its flip side, Harnfell, Horn of Bounty. This 5-mana artifact lets us discard a card so we can exile the top 2 cards of our library and cast them that turn. Having an ideal storm turn usually means striking a balance between having enough card advantage and mana acceleration on hand. So having the option of both on one card is very welcome in a deck like this and will very much help our storm turns go the way we want them to. Another card that can act as card advantage and mana acceleration is Professional Facebreaker, a 3-mana creature with menace that says, whenever one or more creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, create a treasure token. Also, sacrifice a treasure, exile the top card of your library. You may play that card this turn. So you couldn't ask for a better card for this deck. It starts by coming with inbuilt evasion in the form of menace, very welcome when we plan to go to combat often and quickly. And when we get in with damage, we not only get mana from the treasures to cast the cards in our hand, but if we are low on cards, we can just crack the treasures to exile cards and play them that turn. Normally impulse draw effects that only let you play them that turn aren't a welcome sight for most decks, but because we plan on playing fast with a lot of mana accelerants, this shouldn't be a problem, especially if we end up making many face breakers that turn. This card is simply one of the best cards you can curve into early and will be a reason for some of your fastest wins. Stormkiln Artist is a 4-mana creature that generates a treasure every time we cast or copy an instant or sorcery. Whilst the copy ability won't be relevant most of the time, just that cast ability can produce an incredible amount of treasures with the right setup. If we have gone to combat and have, say, 4 Stormkiln's second main phase, we can generate 4 treasures for every instant and sorcery we cast. This will very easily let us storm off, and the only thing that will limit us will be access to card draw in hand. If that wasn't enough, Stormkiln can also become quite the lethal combat threat. Gaining +1/+0 for each artifact we control means if we have enough treasures on hand, one or more opponents can be taken out of the game. Stormkiln Artist is one of, if not the most powerful mana generators we have if we plan to storm off in our second main phase. Solemn Simulacrum is a 4-mana creature that puts a basic land into play tapped upon its ETB and also draws us a card when it dies. A strong value piece if we don't have one of our strong finishers in hand, this will often help us to ramp quickly with permanent mana sources to either set up for a storm turn or help recast Rionya if it has been targeted consistently. If we make enough copies of Solemn and one opponent's life is getting low enough, we may be able to force them to block and hence draw a few cards when the clones die. Atsushi the Blazing Sky is one of the few creatures that are legendary in the deck and also one we plan to clone, but for good reason. When it dies, as will happen when we make multiple copies and the legend rule kicks in, it gives us the choice of making 3 treasure tokens or exiling the top 2 cards of our library and being able to play them until next turn. So here we have another card that grants us card advantage and mana acceleration, but with additional benefit. When each clone dies, we decide which one we get, so we can choose the mode most appropriate for what cards we have in hand or exile. Although we won't be able to use the Atsushi clones in combat, The value it generates means it acts as more of a storm enabler for our other finishers rather than a finisher itself. Our last mana accelerant is Ancient Copper Dragon. While expensive for this deck as a 6 mana creature, it can produce absolutely incredible amounts of treasure if we can clone it even a few times. Copper Dragon says, whenever it deals combat damage to a player, roll a d20. You create a number of treasure tokens equal to the result. So with say 3 dragons attacking, we can make anywhere from 3 to 60 treasure tokens, most often somewhere between 20 to 40 of them. This will be more than enough mana to end the game, so our only limit will be our card advantage available. Not only this, but coming with flying and 6/5 stats means it can be quite the potent combat threat with enough copies on board. A 6 mana creature is a big ask for this style of deck, but when the power level is high enough like it is for Ancient Copper Dragon, its inclusion is worth it. And that covers our mana acceleration cards. Now let's look at the other half of the puzzle, our card advantage pieces, to make sure that we can storm off and continue to draw the cards that we need to. First on our list is Ancestral Anger, Crash Through, Crimson Wisps, Expedite, Overmaster, Renegade Tactics, Roll, and Warlord's Fury. These are all 1 mana cards that draw us a card, in addition to providing some other ability. While many of these abilities will be useful at times, for example, Overmaster and its ability to make the next instant or sorcery we cast uncounterable, they are all here largely for their low cost and card draw. Faithless Looting is another 1 mana sorcery, but instead of providing card advantage, it loots instead, helping us find the cards we need. In addition to its low cost, it's also here because we can flash it back for 3 mana, helping to build our Rionya count when we need it. Thrill of Possibility, Tormenting Voice, and Wild Guess are all 2 mana spells that draw us 2 cards when we discard a card as part of its cost. Similar to Faithless Looting, these help us to dig to the cards we need and adds to our Rionya count. Though we will discuss these soon, filling our graveyard up will also work nicely with some other cards we run in the deck. Seize the Spoils is a 3 mana version of the previous cards, except it also generates us a treasure. Because of this, we can cast this turn 3 and use it as a ramp spell too, so that we are better prepared for the turn we storm off. Reckless Impulse is a 2 mana sorcery that lets us exile the top 2 cards of our library and play them until our next turn. This is simply quite good card advantage for a deck like ours looking to go fast and have as many cards available to play, especially with all the big mana accelerants we run. Humble Defector is a 2 mana creature that says, tap to draw 2 cards, then an opponent gains control of it, but we can only do this during our turn. This is a very powerful card advantage piece for the cost, because when we clone it, we draw the cards but our opponents never get to use the clones because they exile at our end step. A couple of copies of this should quickly refill our hand and set up a perfect storm turn when we go for it next. Light Up the Stage is a 3 mana sorcery that exiles the top 2 cards of our library and lets us play them until our next turn. But we can also cast it for 1 mana if an opponent lost life this turn, useful in our second main phase to prepare to storm next turn. Brayer's Apprentice is a 3 mana creature that makes a Thopter token when it ETBs. It also says you can tap it and sacrifice an artifact to choose one, and either exile the top card of your library until the end of your next turn you may play that card, or target creature gets +2/+0 until end of turn. Now while that second ability may have edge cases where it becomes relevant, you will almost always be playing this to gain card advantage from sacking an artifact, here that artifact being the token it makes. But also remember that Brayer's Apprentice is an artifact too, so if you need to keep the Thopter tokens around, say as blockers for big hitting flyers, you can sack the Apprentice instead. Tectonic Giant is a 4 mana creature that says, whenever Tectonic Giant attacks or becomes the target of a spell an opponent controls, choose one. You can either deal 3 damage to each opponent, or exile the top 2 cards of your library, choose one of them, until the end of your next turn, you may play that card. So Tectonic Giant serves 2 purposes here. In most cases it will be card advantage, allowing us to filter through to find the cards we need, but in cases where we can get a high Rionya count, between Tectonic's 3 damage to each opponent effect, combined with its 4/4 baseline, this can potentially be a finisher, especially in the early game when our opponents have little to no blockers. Our last card advantage piece is Caves of Chaos Adventurer, a 4 mana 5/3 creature with trample that gives us the initiative when it ETBs. It also says, whenever Caves of Chaos Adventurer attacks, exile the top card of your library. If you've completed a dungeon, you may play that card this turn without paying its mana cost. Otherwise, you may play that card this turn. So when we first play Adventurer, we gain the initiative and go through the first part of the Undercity. This means if we get Rionya's trigger to make 4 more Adventurers, we will have not only completed a dungeon, meaning all the cards we exile we can cast for free this turn, but the last room also lets us dig deep for a creature to put into play for free. So in this deck, Adventurer provides a lot of value, and if we hit the right cards from its triggers, it can potentially set us up to storm off and win the game. And that covers our card advantage package. Now we know how we're making mana and getting cards to play, just how are we interacting with our opponents? Well, as they say, sometimes the best form of removal is player removal, and if you ask me, there's nothing more red than hitting your opponents for a big amount of damage. So let's look at the cards that are going to help take them down. Fury is a 5 mana 3/3 with double strike that says, when Fury enters the battlefield, it deals 4 damage divided as you choose among any number of target creatures and or planeswalkers. Also, we can evoke it by exiling a red card from our hand. So Fury's ETB helps us eliminate any problematic creatures on the board, and the fact we can divide its damage means it's also great as an early play to wipe out some mana dorks and utility creatures. Having the ability to evoke it is also very powerful, and with a high enough Rionya count, evoking it should clear the board and get some serious damage in with its double strike ability. Calamity Bearer is a 4 mana giant that says, if a giant source you control will deal damage to a permanent or player, it deals double that damage to that permanent or player instead. If we get this out early, it won't be hard to take multiple opponents out. With its baseline stats as a 3/4, if we make 4 copies of this, each one that connects to a player will deal 96 damage, which should be more than enough to get the job done. Devilish Valet is a 3 mana 1/3 with trample and haste and says, whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, double Devilish Valet's power until end of turn. Similar to Calamity Bearer, if we get enough copies of this out, it will hit our opponents hard, likely hard enough to take them out of the game. If we make 6 copies of Valet, each will be a 32/2 with the original becoming a 64/2. In most cases, this will be enough to take out all 3 of our opponents. Fanatic of Mogus is a 4 mana creature that deals damage to each opponent based on our devotion to red. If we assume all of our opponents are on 40 life and we only have Rionya and Mogus on board, making 5 copies of it will deal exactly 40 damage to each opponent, and that isn't even counting the damage the 4/2 bodies can get in themselves. This is quite a strong finisher for the cost, and with a few extra red cards on board, will kill our opponents with ease. Inferno Titan is a 6 mana 6/6 that says, pay a red and Inferno Titan gets +1/+0 until end of turn. Also, whenever Inferno Titan enters the battlefield or attacks, it deals 3 damage divided as you choose among 1, 2, or 3 targets. So like Ancient Copper Dragon, this is another example of an expensive creature that has a very powerful effect. Each copy of Titan we make essentially deals 6 damage to any target, then it also hits with another 6 damage due to its strong baseline stats. Early or late, multiple copies of Titan will have a big impact on the game and help to shut down or end any opponent causing us too much trouble. Our last opponent ender is Terror of the Peaks, a 5 mana 5/4 flyer that says, spells your opponents cast that target Terror of the Peaks cost an additional 3 life to cast, and whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, Terror of the Peaks deals damage equal to that creature's power to any target. So to start with, having a strong body with evasion means our clones are likely to get in for combat damage. If we make 4 copies of this, each copy will deal 15 damage to any target and the original 20 damage. This is simply game ending and mana for mana one of the best player finishes in the deck. But our interaction doesn't end there. We still have a few pieces that slow our opponents while still being able to be used on our storm turns to buff Rionya's count. The first is Chaos Warp, risky removal that shuffles a permanent into its owner's library and putting a permanent into play if that's what gets revealed off the top of their library. Deflecting SWAT acts as protection for our commander, which will be kill on sight most of the time, but we can also use it proactively on any of our spells or abilities too. Remember that changing the targets is a may, so you can actually cast it just for the sake of casting it. Last up is Tybalt's Trickery, a counter spell in a pinch that also casts a random non-land spell for free for the player's spell it's targeting. Again, we can use this on our own spells if needed to help Rionya's ability. So that covers the cards that are interaction and win cons for the deck. Now let's look at our utility cards which are going to help us win faster and harder. Our first card to discuss is Flame Jab. This is a 1 mana sorcery that deals 1 damage to any target. Not a great ability for the cost, I'll admit, but it also has one other important ability, Retrace. This means we can cast this card from our graveyard by discarding a land in addition to paying its usual cost. This is actually quite useful to have when we are storming off and drawing lands that we would rather be anything else. In addition, Flame Jab also makes good discard fodder for our cantrips that require discarding a card as an additional cost. Sometimes cards such as these will get Rionya's trigger count high enough to end the game than would be possible otherwise. Lightning Greaves provides haste and shroud for our commander, which our deck is heavily relying on to function. It can also help a big beater such as Inferno Titan or Ancient Copper Dragon swing in straight away for immediate value. Now the combat step is important for our deck and we can make a large number of clones with just one of them. but if we can get more than one with enough triggers on Rionya, our opponent's defeat is hastened greatly. Relentless Assault is a 4-mana sorcery that untaps all the creatures that attack that turn and gives us an additional combat phase followed by an additional main phase. Fury of the Horde has the same effect, except it costs 7 mana instead of 4, but it also gives us the option of casting it for free if we exile 2 red cards from our hand. This is a very powerful option to have when our second main phase hits and we have red cards in hand that aren't useful at the current time. Seize the Day is a 4-mana sorcery that untaps a single creature and then gives another combat followed by another main phase. Although untapping only a single creature seems like a big downside, this is more than made up for by the fact that it can be flashed back for 3 mana. So in essence, if we have access to 7 mana over the turn, this provides us with 2 combat steps, which should be more than enough to take the game, especially considering casting this spell itself adds to Rionya's trigger count. Aggravated Assault is a 3-mana enchantment that we can pay 5 mana into as many times as we'd like to gain an extra combat phase and main phase. This is the most powerful of the extra combat cards in the deck because being able to activate it multiple times will usually be enough to take the game, especially with Ancient Copper Dragon, which can easily go infinite with it. But truth be told, Rionya's effect can be so powerful if we get her count high enough that resolving any of these extra combat spells should mean big trouble for our opponents. Sometimes though, we need ways to recur our spells, whether it be for a higher Rionya count or to simply recast powerful spells like our extra combat ones. Well, Mizzix's Mastery is a 4-mana sorcery that lets us exile an instant or sorcery from our graveyard and cast a copy of it for free. But if we overload it for 8 mana, we can cast a copy of all the instants and sorceries in our graveyard. Although 8 mana is a lot, every spell we are copying does count as being cast, so this will add to Rionya's trigger count. As you could imagine, resolving this with a full graveyard could potentially win us the game, or at very least put us in a very strong position to do so. Finale of Promise costs 2 mana and X and says, you may cast up to 1 target instant card and or sorcery from your graveyard, each with a mana value X or less, without paying their mana costs. If a spell cast this way will be put into your graveyard, exile it instead. If X is 10 or more, copy each of those spells twice. You may choose new targets for the copies. So most often we will be just copying 2 spells once, which is powerful enough on its own, especially considering that it can add 3 to Rionya's trigger count, but having the option to dump mana into it is also nice to have. Ardent Elementist is a 4-mana creature that returns an instant or sorcery to our hand when it ETBs. If we have a full graveyard, we can target the Elementist with Rionya's trigger to get all our instants and sorceries back to our hand and storm off then and there, or at least set up for next turn. Our last recursion piece is Underworld Breach, which gives all our non-land cards escape until end of turn where Breach sacrifices itself. Considering how many spells we plan to cast, as well as discard due to additional costs, it shouldn't be hard for Underworld Breach to be effective at recasting at least a few key spells. Notably, being able to recur any non-land card, not just instants and sorceries, means we can bring back game-winning cards like Aggravated Assault or Fanatic of Mogus. Bonus Round is a 3-mana sorcery that says, until end of turn, whenever a player casts an instant or sorcery spell, that player copies it and may choose new targets for the copy. Being able to copy our cantrips and rituals makes it easy to cast more cantrips and rituals, getting Rionya's trigger count higher and therefore increasing our chances of a one-shot kill. Heat Shimmer is the 3-mana sorcery that says, create a token that's a copy of target creature, except it has haste and, at the beginning of the end step, exile this permanent. Sometimes this will be used on a high-value creature we own, like Stormkiln Artist, but often we will actually clone an opponent's high-value creature. So with the right creature and a high enough Rionya count, this spell could potentially be game-ending. Harmonic Prodigy is a 2-mana creature that has prowess and says, if an ability of a shaman or another wizard you control triggers, that ability triggers an additional time. Because Rionya is a wizard, we get to trigger her effect a second time. Now often, just getting one Rionya trigger can cause quite a lot of damage to our opponents, so doubling up on it makes this very dangerous for them. But Prodigy's usefulness doesn't end there. Stormkiln Artist, Ardent Elementist, and Fanatic of Mogus also trigger an additional time thanks to Prodigy, increasing the danger of this card further. Our last utility piece is Sundial of the Infinite, a 2-mana artifact that lets us end the turn, provided it is our turn. This card serves one simple function, to let us keep what we clone by activating it on the end step when the exile trigger goes on the stack. If we have this out and have just finished combat with 4 to 5 Inferno Titans, Ancient Copper Dragons, or Terror of the Peaks on the battlefield, our opponents will be in big trouble if they don't wipe the board before our next turn. And that covers our utility cards. Now let's look at any notable lands that we run. Ancient Tomb helps accelerate into our commander or key creature quickly, hitting our opponents fast before they have a chance to hit back. Cavern of Souls is important for a deck like ours that relies heavily on its commander. Naming Wizard also helps other important creatures resolve, like Harmonic Prodigy. Nykthos Shrine to Nyx can add red mana equal to our devotion to red when we pay 2 mana into it. This can be quite explosive when we use it on our second main phase, while all our clones are still on the battlefield. Shatterskull Smash-In can be an untapped land at the cost of 3 life when we need it, but we can also pay mana into it to deal X damage divided as we choose among up to 2 target creatures and or planeswalkers. If X is 6 or more, it deals twice X damage divided as we choose among them instead. But also remember, if we just need to get Rionya's trigger count higher, we can just pay 2 red to deal no damage to a target. So Smash-In serves to be a land for turn, interaction, and an extra trigger for Rionya, depending on what we need at the time. Spikefield Hazard can be played as a tapped land for turn, or for 1 mana we can cast it as an instant, dealing 1 damage to any target. This is simply here to add to Rionya's trigger count, hopefully taking out a mana dork or token creature on the way to the graveyard. Our last land to discuss is Valakut Awakening, a tapped land when we need it to be, but a 3 mana card advantage piece when we don't. Although 3 mana starts to get high for where we want our card draw to be, having this not be a dead draw as we start storming off and being able to have it take the place of a land slot makes it worth including. And that covers our important lands. Now this is normally the part of the deck tech where I discuss the spicy synergies and the powerful plays the deck can make, and it certainly can. But in the spirit of this deck epitomizing what it means to be a red player, I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to give the red players what they truly want, the numbers on just how much damage their creatures can do in 1 turn. So let's get to it. Firstly, let's examine the damage output of Calamity Bearer. Now for each of these creatures, I'm going to assume we can make at least 2 copies because in playtesting, that's been the bare minimum we can almost always reach. So at 2 copies, each will deal 24 damage upon connecting. At 4 copies, each will deal 96 damage. And at 6 copies, each will deal 384 damage. Next up is Devilish Valet. At 2 copies, each copy will be a 2-3 and the original a 4-3, honestly pretty underwhelming. At 4 copies, each will become an 8-3 and the original a 16-3, some more respectable numbers, but at 6 copies, each will become a 32-3 and the original a 64-3. Keeping in mind they will have trample, so blockers become much less relevant. 2 copies of Fanatic of Mogus with Rionya out will deal 5 damage per copy to each opponent for 10 total damage. With 4 copies, each copy will now deal 7 damage each for 28 total damage. And with 6 copies of Fanatic, each copy will deal 9 damage for 54 total damage. Finally, 2 copies of Terror of the Peaks will deal 5 damage per copy to any target and 10 damage for the original. 4 copies will deal 15 damage per copy and 20 with the original, and 6 copies will deal 25 damage per copy and 30 with the original. And that's the deck. When you look at Rionya's ability, how the deck plays out and what it asks from you, nothing feels more red than this. Like the traditional red decks from other formats, this one plays hard and fast, looking to put it all on the line to take out its opponents as quickly as possible. If you've come from another format playing mono red, or simply want to know what it's like to play true mono red in Commander, then this is the deck for you. Rionya has the ability to put out incredible amounts of damage in 1 turn, and in the early game as well. But this also makes her a kill-on-sight commander for your opponents, and if she is interacted with enough, the deck is largely shut down. So if you decide to build this deck, make sure to know what you're signing up for. But for the true red player, the juice is worth the squeeze, because the times you do get shut down are going to be more than made up for when you kill them with huge amounts of damage out of nowhere. Well, that's it from me. I hope you enjoyed this look into Rionya Fire Dancer, and if you like the deck, make sure to stop by the channel where we will have some gameplay videos up so you can see the deck in action. But until then, take care guys.